Yeah.
So if there can't be any political legitimacy, what's your best case scenario for a 21st century Muslim civilization? Is it democracy? And I mean, how would you see it? I mean, we keep saying there doesn't exist an Islamic State, but
yeah, exactly.
Where would you want to go with that?
It actually becomes rather open because the state's legitimacy is only ad hoc. There has to be a state because there has to be a state to hold things back. So a state must exist, but it doesn't derive any religious legitimacy. It's only legitimate to the extent which it upholds justice.
So separation of church and state, so to speak? I mean, that would be your picture of
I would
this
maintain
scenario?
that there's always been an effective separation of church and state in Islam. Because the fact is, the caliphs early on arrogated to themselves church and state, but that didn't stick and it didn't work. And the caliph's own religious authority was emptied of its religiosity and spiritual value by the very exercise of political authority.
I understand that, and that point's been made many times, and I happen to agree with it. But what do you see? I mean, do you see functioning democracies with viable economies that coexist in regional coalitions, or that, I mean, what do you see that's going to actually work, that would satisfy the Muslim community?
Well, I think what would satisfy the Muslim community would be that there be a freedom for the Muslims to organize themselves according to Islamic law in their own communities. And that would satisfy the Muslim community, I would say. If the Muslims can organize themselves under their law, which is the center of their religion in their own communities, that would be satisfactory. In other words, if pluralism was allowed, that would be fine. And it remains to be seen whether it's going to be allowed. Now, as Jim was saying, the United States hasn't been imposing its law, nor if we change that to a consortium of Western countries, like the Big Seven or whatever, haven't been imposing their law on the Muslim countries directly. That is, a Muslim country has theoretically the choice to choose between whether to apply the Islamic law or not. And as a result, the Muslim personal status law is still applied in the majority of the Muslim countries in some form or other, often not in the classical Orthodox form, but in some form it exists. And so the desire of the Muslims would be, first of all, that be allowed to continue and that there not be some kind of mandated homogenizing decrees that come down that force every country and every place to be like every other place. Because that would then be exactly what you were saying has not happened, would then have happened. And the political rights also, though, will need to be addressed, because the other half of the equation is the need for justice. And that is lacking in the political governments of many of the Muslim countries. So the Muslims there would desire an acknowledgement that democratic parliamentarian government is welcome for Muslim countries as well as non-Muslim ones. And that was not very evident when the FIS won the elections in Algeria. And then, because that area was conceded sort of as a bailiwick to France by the Western powers, the United States remained silent about it, and France supported the eradicators, who are the military dictators that refused to recognize the results of the election, in utter contrast to the way that Eastern Europe was treated. And part of the motivation for that could be that if the Muslim countries were democratic, they would be less amenable rather than more amenable to giving up their rights, so to speak, to have their own systems pluralistically. See, if Iraq was governed by a democratic government, or should a democratic government arise in Iraq now, or after Saddam Hussein at any time, that will certainly, the government will, through inquiries, open the file of the Gulf War and examine that. And the Iraqis will be saying things about the Gulf War from their point of view. And those things will not just all be, thank you for raining down bombs on Saddam Hussein. You know, it's going to be another different type of inquiry than that. And also, if Iraq were a democratic country, there couldn't be a sanctions regime against it. Well, if a democratic Iraq did what Saddam Hussein did, it could be, perhaps, but it wouldn't do that, because Saddam Hussein did that out of his own megalomania and the pressures he felt on himself as a very threatened ruler. And so, yes, we actually support a kind of Islamic democracy. We support Islamic Muslim political participation, Islamic democracy, which would mean a parliamentary regime that is not identified with the religion and is somewhat separated from it. But it wouldn't necessarily be a carbon copy of a European parliamentary model either, because you would have to work out in the Islamic law exactly what the relationships would be between the rulers and the ruled, and in particular what the nature of judicial authority would be. Because judicial authority is always passive, negative, critical, you know, that type of thing, versus the active, intrusive authority of the executive power of the state. See? So there would still be, you know, some room for the use of Islamic law in the legal system and so forth in such a state. And indeed, if a majority of the people wish to enact that kind of law, why should they not have the right to do so? That is the point. And of course, as you've seen also from Sheikh Hamza's presentations, the Islamic law is very varied, and there are lots of problems and disagreements in it. And I've stated some of them also, as for example, the difference of opinion about the permissibility of abortion, which is 180 degrees. That one side says, you know, through 120 days you can do it, and the other side says, no, you can't. So, you know, and then various shadings in the middle that you could if there were certain circumstances, but not in other circumstances. So, one ought to, you know, the Muslims should be let to work out the political arrangements themselves somehow. And those arrangements ought to take a democratic direction. That would be what I would say. Okay? And the state should not be endowed with an air of sanctity. That is a very bad idea. The state is the realm of compromise, of political infighting, of disagreement, and most certainly of a lack of perfection. And everyone, I think, will acknowledge that. And I think no one will imagine that either the state we are living in nor any other state has ever been actually perfect. And it shouldn't be invested with an aura of religiosity. That would be a very bad idea.